The holy warships descended through the red clouds like judgment falling from heaven. Cardinal Dreth had brought 12 vessels, each one armed with enough firepower to reduce the ancient beacon to dust along with everyone inside it. Ziyong watched them approach through a window that had not been transparent until he touched it. "We cannot fight them," Torin said quietly, "and we cannot run because they have already surrounded the beacon on all sides." "I did not intend to fight or run," Taeyong replied. Sareth Va was still at the main console studying the architect records with desperate intensity. "There is something here about the scepter's broadcasting capability," she announced, "and it says the weapon can transmit data to every architect system in the galaxy simultaneously. You want to share what we learned?" Torin realized, "I want to give people the truth and let them decide what to do with it." Cardinal Dreth's voice erupted from every speaker in the beacon as he broadcast on all frequencies. "Human creature," he declared, "you have stolen our sacred relic and murdered a faithful servant and corrupted our high priestess with your lies, and for these crimes, you will die along with all who aided you." Taeyong activated the beacon's communication system and spoke calmly. "I did not steal anything, and I bought this scepter at a yard sale on Earth for $12, and I killed the assassin you sent to murder me in self-defense." More lies from an unworthy beast who should never have been allowed to walk among civilized peoples. "The scepter chose me according to your own sacred texts, and your priests verified its authenticity with your own ancient records. Then our texts are corrupted, and our records are false, because no merciful God would choose a creature from a species as violent and chaotic and unpredictable as humanity." Sareth Va stepped up beside Taeyong. "Cardinal Dreth," she said, "I have accessed the original architect records stored in this beacon, and I have learned the truth about our faith and about the beings we worshipped as gods. Silence, heretic, because your words carry no weight and your authority has been stripped from you by the Conclave. The architects were not gods, and they were scientists who created life according to templates they could predict and control, and they fled from this galaxy because they detected species they could not understand. Blasphemy of the highest order. Humans evolved outside their designs, and human minds operate in ways the architects never anticipated, and that is why the scepter accepts them and rejects us, because it was built to identify exactly what humans are." Dreth's response was to order his ships to fire plasma beams, struck the beacon's outer shell, and the entire structure shook but held firm because architect engineering had survived for millennia and could survive a few more minutes of bombardment. "The beacon shields will not last long," Torin reported. Taeyong looked at the scepter and thought about what Sareth Va had proposed. He could broadcast the truth to every Kovani world and every temple and every believer across 12 star systems. He could destroy a faith that had given meaning to billions of lives for 3,000 years. He could tear down everything these people believed and leave them with nothing but the cold knowledge that their gods were just scientists who ran away. "I cannot make this choice for your people," he said. Sareth Va stared at him in confusion. "What do you mean? You want me to tell everyone that their religion is based on a misunderstanding, and that the beings they worship were afraid of creatures like me, and you think that will somehow make things better? The truth should make things better. Maybe, but it should not come from me, because I am an outsider who accidentally stumbled into your holiest place with a walking stick I bought for $12. He walked to the beacon's main console and studied the controls. "Can you set this to broadcast?" "Raw data without any interpretation or commentary." Sareth Va nodded slowly as she began to understand. "You want to show them the records and let them decide for themselves what to believe. I want to give them the evidence and trust them to be smart enough to figure out what it means, because that is what I would want someone to do for me." She configured the broadcast parameters while another volley of plasma fire shook the beacon. Taeyong raised the scepter and pressed it against the transmission interface. Power flowed through the weapon and into the beacon and out across the galaxy. Every architect system that had awakened became a relay station for the broadcast. Every temple received the original records showing what the architects truly were. Every believer saw the evidence that their gods were mortal beings who created life and then fled from the unexpected. And with the evidence came a simple message recorded by De Jong in the moments before the transmission. My name is Yoon De Jong, and I am a cargo hauler from Earth, and 3 years ago I bought a walking stick at a yard sale because I thought it looked interesting, and that walking stick turned out to be something your ancestors built a religion around. I did not ask for this, and I do not want to be your chosen one or your prophet or your enemy. What I am showing you is the truth as best as I understand it, and you can decide what it means for your faith, because that choice belongs to you and not to me. I believe that any faith worth having should be strong enough to survive the truth, and if your beliefs cannot handle new information, then maybe they need to change and grow the way all living things change and grow. Whatever you decide, I hope you will stop trying to kill me, because I really just want to fix my ship and deliver my cargo and go home. The broadcast ended and silence fell across the galaxy. In the skies above the beacon, Cardinal Dress fleet hung motionless as crews on every ship processed what they had just witnessed. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Then one by one the warships began to turn away. Dreth himself never gave the order to stand down, but his followers made the choice without him because they had seen the evidence and they needed time to understand what it meant. 3 days later, De Jong finally returned to the spaceport, where his freighter had been waiting all this time with its engines fully repaired. Torren Vesh accompanied him to the landing pad. What will happen now? De Jong asked. Cardinal Dreth has retreated into seclusion, and Sareth Va is leading a council to discuss how our faith should evolve in light of what we have learned, and it will take years, or possibly generations, to work through all of it. Will your people be okay? I think we will be, because the truth is difficult, but it is also clarifying. And now we can build a faith based on what we actually know instead of what we assumed. De Jong held out the scepter. This belongs to your people, and it always did, and I just carried it home for a while. Torren shook his head. The beacon records say that only beings like you can safely wield it. And we would not know what to do with a weapon anyway, because we are priests, not warriors. Then, what am I supposed to do with it? Perhaps you will find another yard sale, or you can sell it to someone else who needs an interesting walking stick. De Jong laughed for the first time in days and tucked the scepter under his arm. He climbed into his ship and powered up the engines and lifted off from the planet that had nearly killed him and had definitely changed him. As his freighter broke through the atmosphere, Sareth Va's voice came through his communication system. Human. De Jong, I want to thank you for what you did. I did not do anything except tell the truth. That is exactly what I mean, because you could have used the scepter to make yourself a god, and you could have broadcast whatever message you wanted, and shaped our entire civilization to worship you, but instead, you gave us facts and trusted us to be worthy of them. It seemed like the decent thing to do. Perhaps that is what makes humans so unpredictable, because you keep choosing decency when you do not have to. The communication ended and De Jong set course for Nexus 7, where a colony was still waiting for their water filters. Behind him, Velareth Prime grew smaller until it was just another dot among the stars. He looked at the scepter resting against the co-pilot's seat and wondered how something so important had ended up in a yard sale on Earth. Then he decided it did not matter, because sometimes the universe just worked in strange ways, and sometimes a cargo hauler with a bad knee could accidentally teach an ancient civilization that faith should be built on truth instead of fear. He engaged the jump drive and vanished into the black, and somewhere in the void the architects who had been hiding for so long felt something they had not experienced in millions of years. They felt curious about what humanity would do next. The moment the scepter fired, something changed across the entire galaxy. On 17 different worlds, ancient structures that had stood silent for millennia suddenly hummed with power. Beacons that had been dark since before the Corvani discovered. Fire began broadcasting signals into deep space. Stations hidden inside asteroids and moons flickered to life and started running programs that no living being had written. Tae-Yong knew none of this as he stood in the Forbidden's archive staring. At the spot where the assassin had vanished, his hands would not stop shaking, and the scepter pulsed with a gentle warmth that might have been comforting if he had not just used it to erase someone from existence. "We need to leave immediately," Sarathva said with urgency in her voice. "I killed him," Tae-Yong whispered. "You defended yourself against someone who was trying to murder you, and we can discuss the moral implications later, but right now we must move." She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a hidden passage that led away from the main temple. Torin Vesh was waiting for them at the exit with a small transport vehicle. "Cardinal Dreth has declared you a heretic," Torin reported as they climbed aboard, "and he is mobilizing his forces to purge the temple of all who supported you. Where can we go?" Tae-Yong asked. "There is an architect beacon on the northern continent," Sarathva answered. And it was the first structure the architects built on our world, and if any place holds answers about the scepter, it will be there. They flew through the night while fires burned in the temple district behind them. Dreth's followers had begun their purge, and screams echoed across the city as priests who had shown kindness to the human were dragged from their chambers. Tae-Yong felt sick because none of this would be happening if he had just stayed on his ship and waited for the repairs. By dawn, they reached the beacon, which stood alone in a vast desert of red sand. It was a tower of black stone that rose higher than any building Zhang had ever seen, and it pulsed with light that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside its structure. It activated. Sarathva breathed in amazement. "And it has been dormant since before my grandmother's grandmother was born." They entered through a doorway that had been sealed for thousands of years, but now stood open as if expecting visitors inside. The walls were covered with text and images that moved and changed as they watched. Sarathva ran her fingers across the symbols with tears streaming down her face. "I have spent my entire life trying to understand fragments of this language," she said, "and now I can read it as clearly as my own name because the beacon is translating it for us." She began reading aloud, and what she read changed everything. The architects were not gods. They were scientists from a civilization so old that they had watched the first stars form and die. They had seeded the galaxy with life according to careful plans and precise genetic templates. Every species that emerged was designed to fit specific parameters, and their evolution followed predictable paths, and their neurology operated within known boundaries. The Corvani were one of their creations. So were the other elder races who shared this region of space, every intelligent species the galaxy had known for millions of years had been engineered by the architects, and all of them could be modeled and predicted and controlled. Then what are humans? Torin asked. Sarathva scrolled through more text until she found the answer. "Humans are not in the database," she said slowly, "because humans evolved on a world the architects never seeded. That is not possible." Torin protested. "The records are clear, and they show every planet where the architects planted life, and Earth is not among them." She continued reading with growing horror on her face. The architects detected humanity approximately 10,000 years ago when human neural patterns first became complex enough to register on their monitoring systems, and they were immediately concerned. Why? Because human brains do not operate within the parameters they established, and human thought patterns cannot be predicted by their models, and human behavior falls outside every projection they created. Tae-Yong thought about human history with its wars and its art and its random acts of cruelty and kindness, and he supposed that unpredictable was a fair description. The scepter was designed to identify beings who walk between. Sarathva continued, and that phrase does not mean spiritually enlightened beings as we always believed. What does it mean? It means beings whose neurology exists between the boundaries of the architect's designs and beings who cannot be modeled or predicted or controlled. She turned to look at Dae-young with an expression of wonder and fear. The scepter was not meant to find a chosen one in the religious sense, and it was meant to find species, like humans who developed outside the architect's parameters. Why would they want to find us? Sarath Va scrolled to the final section of the record, and her voice trembled as she read. The architects did not ascend to godhood as our religion teaches, and they did not transcend physical existence to watch over their creations from some higher plane. Then where did they go? They went into hiding because they detected species emerging that they could not understand and could not predict and could not control, and they were afraid. The words hung in the air like a sentence of judgment. The architects were afraid of beings like you, Sarathva said to Dae-young, and the scepter was never a holy relic meant to bless the worthy. Then, what was it? It was an alarm system designed to identify the unpredictable ones before they could spread too far. And now that you have activated it, every architect system in the galaxy knows that a human is holding the weapon they feared most. An alert chimed from outside the beacon. Torin checked his communicator, and his face went pale. Cardinal Dreth's fleet has found us, he reported, and they will be here within the hour. Dae-young looked at the scepter in his hand and finally understood why a yard sale trinket had turned into the most important object in the galaxy. It was not because the gods had chosen him. It was because the beings everyone thought were gods had run away from creatures like him and left their alarm systems behind, and now those alarms were ringing. Word spread across Corvani space faster than any ship could travel. Within hours of the verification ceremony, the story of the human and the holy scepter had reached every temple and every home and every ship in 12 star systems. The responses varied wildly from fervent belief to violent rejection. Pilgrims began arriving on Velarith, prime in numbers that overwhelmed the spaceport, and the streets filled with believers who wanted to see the chosen one with their own eyes. Some brought gifts and offerings and prayers written on sacred paper. Others brought weapons hidden beneath their robes because they could not accept that a primitive human could be worthy of divine selection. Dae-young found himself trapped inside the temple, for his own protection with guards posted at every entrance and exit. He had given up asking when he could return to his ship because the answer was always the same. Quiet shake of the head that meant not yet and possibly not ever. The cargo of water filters he was supposed to deliver would be very late, and he would probably lose his contract, but that seemed like a small problem compared to accidentally becoming a religious figure. Torin Vesh had recovered from his encounter with the scepter, and he visited Dae-young every day to ask questions about humans and Earth and how life worked on a planet where nobody believed in the architects. You truly have no gods, Torin asked during one of their conversations. We have many gods, Dae-young corrected him, but they are all different depending on where you come from and what your family believed, and many humans have no gods at all. How do you find meaning without a unified faith? We argue about it constantly, and sometimes we fight about it, but mostly we just try to be decent to each other and hope that is enough. Torin seemed troubled by this answer, as if the idea of meaning without certainty was too large to fit inside his mind. May I ask you something personal? Dae-young said, Of course. Why did you volunteer to touch the scepter when you knew it might kill you? Torin was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because I've spent my entire life being told what to believe, and I wanted to know something for myself, even if the knowing destroyed me. Dae-young nodded slowly because he understood that feeling, even if he had never risked his life for it. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of angry voices from somewhere deep within the void. temple, a priest burst into the room looking terrified. The conclave of speakers has convened, he announced, and Cardinal Dreth is calling for the human's execution. Daying had heard that name before because the other priests spoke of Cardinal Malin Dreth in whispers filled with fear and respect. He was the leader of the traditional faction within the Kovani faith, and he believed that the ancient texts must be interpreted exactly as written with no room for new ideas or modern understanding. The Cardinal had arrived on Velarith Prime that morning with a fleet of holy warships and an army of loyal followers. He had declared the human's possession of the scepter to be a trick or a theft, or possibly an attack by demonic forces from beyond the known universe. The fact that the scepter's authenticity had been verified did not seem to matter to him. Dae-Young was escorted to a viewing gallery above the conclave chamber where he could watch the proceedings without being seen by most of the assembled priests. Sareth Va stood at one podium while Cardinal Dreth stood at another, and between them sat the 12 speakers who would decide matters of faith and law. The human must be destroyed, Dreth declared in a voice that carried like thunder, and the scepter must be purified of his contaminating touch. The scepter chose him, Sareth Va countered, and our own texts say that the instrument of the gods cannot be deceived. Then, the texts are incomplete, or we have misunderstood them, because no primitive ape from a backwater world could possibly be worthy of architect blessing. And yet he holds the scepter while every Kovani who touches it falls. Perhaps he has found a way to disable the divine protection, and perhaps he is an agent of some enemy we do not yet understand. The argument continued for hours, with neither side willing to give ground. Dae-Young watched and listened and tried to understand how his simple desire to fix his ship had led to this moment where powerful beings debated whether he should live or die. Late that night, Sareth Va came to his quarters with a troubled expression. Cardinal Dreth has requested that I bring you to the Forbidden Archives, she said quietly, but he does not know about this request because I am acting against the will of the Conclave. Why would you risk that? Because I have spent my entire life studying the architects, and I believe there is something in the ancient text that everyone has overlooked, and I need your help to find it. She led him through hidden passages that wound deep beneath the temple until they reached a vault sealed with locks that required prayers to open. Inside were scrolls and tablets and holographic recordings that had not been viewed in centuries. Sareth Va guided Dae-Young to a particular section and activated a display that showed text in the architect language. I have translated this passage 100 times, she said, and I always thought I understood it, but now I'm not sure. The translation appeared beside the original text. It read, "The scepter will identify those who walk between, and they will be unknown to us and unpredictable to us, and that is why we must find them before they find themselves." What does that mean? Dae-Young asked. I always believed it meant spiritually enlightened beings who exist between the mortal and divine realms, but now I wonder if it means something else entirely. Before she could explain further, an alarm sounded from somewhere above them. A guard appeared at the vault entrance with blood on his uniform. An assassin breached the temple, he gasped, and he is coming for the human. Footsteps echoed in the passage behind them, and Dae-Young turned to see a robed figure charging toward him with a blade raised high. He reacted without thinking and raised the scepter to block the attack. The weapon activated. A pulse of energy erupted from its tip and struck the assassin directly in the chest. The attacker did not fall or stumble or cry out. He simply ceased to exist as if he had been erased from reality itself. Dae-Young stared at the empty space where a living being had stood 1 second before. Then he looked down at the scepter humming softly in his trembling hands. What the hell did I just buy? The emergency council chamber beneath the Grand Sanctuary had not been used in over 200 years. Dust covered the ancient seats, and the air smelled of forgotten time, but none of that mattered to the priests who had gathered to decide what to do about the human and his impossible staff. Dae-young sat in a chair that was too tall for him, with his feet dangling several inches above the floor, like a child called to the principal's office. He still held the scepter because every time he tried to set it down, a priest would gasp and beg him not to let it touch anything. Unworthy High Priestess Sarathval stood at the center of the chamber and tried to maintain order as her colleagues argued in voices that grew louder by the minute. "He must be executed," shouted a priest with dark blue robes, "for the crime of stealing our most sacred relic. How could he have stolen it?" countered another priest, "when it vanished 1,000 years before his species discovered fire. Then he is a deceiver. And the staff is a forgery. Impossible, because the staff responds to him, and we all saw the guards try to take it from his hands." Dae-young remembered that moment with uncomfortable clarity, because when a guard had attempted to grab the scepter, the Kovanni had collapsed instantly, as if someone had switched off his brain. The guard had recovered after a few minutes, but he had not tried to touch the staff again. "There is one way to settle the matter of authenticity," Sarathval announced, "and we must pursue it before we make any decisions about the human." She ordered the temple archivists to bring the sacred verification records from the deepest vaults. An hour later, a team of elderly priests arrived carrying containers that looked older than most civilizations. They opened the containers with reverent care and removed holographic projectors that flickered to life with images of the original scepter recorded 3,000 years ago. 17 different tests compared the staff in Dae-young's hand to the artifact in the ancient recordings. The metal composition matched perfectly. The weight was identical down to the smallest measurable unit. The etchings aligned symbol for symbol with zero deviation. The energy signature that the staff emitted was the same unique frequency that had been recorded millennia before. "It is genuine," the head archivist announced with a voice full of awe and fear. "There can be no doubt that this is the true scepter of Varanthal." The chamber erupted into chaos again as priests shouted prayers and accusations and demands in equal measure. A young acolyte named Torin Vesh pushed through the crowd and approached the center of the room. He was barely an adult by Corvani standards, with pale gray skin that had not yet darkened to the blue of maturity. "High Priestess," he called out, "I request permission to test the divine restriction myself." The room fell silent. "You understand," Sarathval said carefully, "that according to our texts, the scepter will kill any unworthy being who attempts to lift it." "I understand," Torin replied, "but I do not believe the human is special, and I think our ancestors made up stories to protect an advanced weapon they did not understand." "That is heresy," someone shouted from the crowd. Perhaps Torin agreed, but if I am right, then we have been worshipping a tool instead of the gods, and that seems like a larger heresy to me. Sarathval considered for a long moment and then nodded. "The human will place the scepter on the floor, and the acolyte will attempt to lift it, and we will see what truth emerges." Dae-young stood up carefully and walked to the center of the chamber. He looked at the young Corvani, who was either very brave or very foolish, or possibly both. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I am sure that I need to know the truth," Torin answered. Dae-young placed the scepter on the stone floor and stepped back. The metal rod lay there looking ordinary and harmless, like any other piece of scrap you might find in the junk shop. Torin approached slowly and reached down with trembling fingers. The moment his skin made contact with the scepter, his entire body went rigid. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor as if his bones had turned to water. Medical priests rushed forward and began scanning him with devices that beeped and hummed with urgent rhythms. "He is alive," one of them announced, "but his neural pathways have temporarily shut down, and he will need time to recover." Torin was carried away on a stretcher, while the assembled priests stared at the scepter still lying on the floor. Sarathval turned to Dae-young with an expression that mixed reverence with genuine confusion. "Please retrieve the holy relic," she said quietly. The Jung walked over and picked up the staff without any difficulty. "How are you doing this?" Sarathva demanded. "I have no idea," De Jong replied honestly, "because until today, I thought this was just a cool-looking walking stick." The High Priestess closed her eyes and seemed to be gathering her thoughts. 3,000 years ago, she began. This scepter was created by beings we call the architects, who existed before any current species achieved civilization. And they were so advanced that our ancestors believed them to be gods. What happened to them? We do not know. Because they vanished and left behind only a few artifacts like this one, and our entire faith is built around understanding their teachings and awaiting their return. She opened her eyes and looked directly at De Jong. The texts say that only a being chosen by the architects could wield this weapon, and for 3,000 years, we assumed that meant a being of great spiritual purity or divine blessing. But I am just a cargo hauler. De Jong said, "Yes, and that is what I cannot understand, because you have no special training and no spiritual preparation, and you purchased a sacred artifact at something called a yard sale." The Jung thought about her words and then asked them why. Simple question. Has anyone ever actually tested whether a human could hold it before? The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know in 3,000 years of waiting for a chosen one. The Kavani had never once considered that a species as young and insignificant as humanity might qualify. They had tested their own people, and they had tested members of the other ancient races who shared their region of the galaxy. But humans were newcomers who had only been traveling among the stars for a few centuries, and nobody had thought to include them in the search for divine favor. No. Sarathva finally admitted with a voice that trembled slightly. "We never imagined that we would need to." The engine warning light had been blinking for 3 days before Yoon Dae-jung finally admitted he needed to land somewhere and get it fixed. He had ignored it at first because warning lights on old freighters were like crying children, and sometimes they just needed to tire themselves out. But when the backup systems started complaining too, and when strange grinding noises came from the starboard thruster housing, he knew he could not keep pretending everything was fine. The nearest planet with repair facilities was a world called Velarith Prime, and Dae-jung had never heard of it before his navigation computer suggested it as an emergency option. He learned quickly that it was a religious world and that millions of pilgrims traveled there every year to visit ancient temples and pray to gods whose names he could not pronounce. None of that mattered to him because he just needed someone to fix his ship so he could deliver his cargo of industrial water filters to the colony. On Nexer 7, the spaceport was small but clean, and the Kavani people who ran it were polite in a stiff and formal way that reminded him of funeral directors. They told him repairs would take at least 2 days and suggested he visit the famous Temple District while he waited because there was nothing else to do in the capital city. Dae-jung shrugged and decided why not, since he had never been much for religion, but he appreciated good architecture, and the temples were supposed to be impressive. He grabbed his walking staff from the ship before he left because his knee still bothered him from an accident years ago when a cargo container had fallen on his leg. The staff was a strange thing he had picked up at an estate sale in Bizen 3 years earlier, and the old woman selling it had not known what it was or where it came from. It was made of some kind of metal that never got too cold or too hot, and it had strange etchings along its length that looked like writing in a language he did not recognize. He had paid $12 for it because it looked interesting and because it was the perfect height for him to lean on when his knee acted up. The Temple District was everything the spaceport workers had promised, and more, with massive structures of white stone that reached toward the purple sky like fingers trying to touch heaven. The being walked slowly through the crowds of Korvani pilgrims who towered over him with their long limbs and their pale blue skin and their eyes that had no visible pupils. They wore robes of different colors that he assumed meant something important, and many of them carried small books that they read from while they walked. He felt out of place in his worn cargo pants and his faded jacket, but nobody seemed to pay him much attention because humans were uncommon here but not unknown. The largest temple sat at the center of the district, and its doors stood open to welcome all visitors according to a sign written in multiple languages, including English. De Jong climbed the steps slowly with his staff clicking against the stone, and he paused at the entrance to appreciate the craftsmanship of the doorframe, which was carved with thousands of tiny figures. He stepped inside and immediately noticed how quiet it became, as if the walls swallowed all sound from the outside world. The interior was vast, with columns that rose so high he could barely see where they ended, and with light streaming through windows made of colored crystal. He took 3 more steps forward, and then everything changed. A priest near the entrance made a sound like a wounded animal and fell to his knees with his hands raised toward De Jong. Then another priest did the same, and then another, until every robed figure in the massive chamber was kneeling on the floor and staring at him with expressions of absolute terror and wonder. Alarms began to sound from somewhere deep within the temple, and De Jong heard the heavy footsteps of guards running toward him from multiple directions. He raised his hands in the universal gesture of surrender, but he did not drop his staff because he was not sure what was happening, and he did not want to fall over if someone pushed him. The guards surrounded him with weapons drawn, but they did not fire, and they did not move closer, and he realized they were all staring at the staff in his hand. An old female Kovani emerged from a side chamber, and the crowd parted for her like water flowing around a stone. She wore robes of deep purple with gold trim and a headdress that added another foot to her already impressive height. Her eyes were fixed on the staff, and her long fingers trembled as she approached him. "How is this possible?" she whispered in accented but clear English. "I am sorry," De Jong said carefully, "but I do not understand what is happening right now." The old female pointed at his staff with a shaking hand. "That is the scepter of Oriental," she said, "the holiest relic of our faith, which disappeared from this very temple 3,000 years ago." De Jong looked down at the metal rod in his hand and then back up at the priestess. "This thing?" he asked. "According to our sacred texts," she continued, "only a being chosen by the gods themselves can lift that weapon, because all others who try are struck dead by divine judgment." The guards shifted nervously, and several priests began to weep openly. De Jong felt his stomach drop as the weight of the situation began to settle on his shoulders. He was standing in the most sacred building on a planet of billions of believers, and he was holding something they considered a divine artifact that should have killed him the moment he touched it. The old priestess drew herself up to her full height and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. "I am High Priestess Sarethfall, and I demand to know how you came to possess the instrument of the gods." De Jong looked at the ornate staff that had been sitting in the corner of his ship for 3 years. He looked at the kneeling priests and the armed guards and the ancient priestess who seemed to be waiting for him to reveal some cosmic truth. Then he said the only honest thing he could say, "I bought this for $12 at a yard sale in Bizen." The silence that followed was so complete that De Jong could hear his own heartbeat. High Priestess Sareth Voss stared at him as if he had spoken in a language that existed beyond the boundaries of comprehension. "What," she finally managed to say, "is a yard sale?"